Alright, let's read this motherfucker. Okay, where were we at? Okay. Don't need to wear headphones. Let me get a haircut. Effects on political parties. What happens when a political party stops acting more or less haphazardly, starts to make systemic propaganda, and instead of trying to win votes at election time, begins to mobilize public opinion in a more permanent fashion? Actually, in the democratic nations, practically no party has tried this. But we can see the emergence of parties grafting themselves onto old ones or replacing them. And these new parties have such aims with which their predecessors did not have. A transformation is taking place in the political parties of the United States. For about a dozen years now, they have been making systematic propaganda. But it is still too early to tell what transformations it may entail in the parties themselves. Therefore, we will study, instead of those parties that make propaganda, as distinguished from those that do not, and consider that their structure derives partially from their need to make propaganda. A party that makes propaganda must, first of all, have the means to express it strongly. It is necessary that the party presents itself as a community in which everybody has a set function, and that its members at the bottom be rigorously organized and strictly obedient. If one wants to reach public opinion constantly, one must proceed with the help of sections and cells. The system of committees, which express themselves weakly, leads only to sporadic and fragmentary action. In addition, propaganda demands vertical liaison. Liaison among the party's organizations. This vertical liaison permits both homogeneity of propaganda and speed of application. And we have seen that speed of action or reaction is essential to propaganda. Conversely, in view of the effect of propaganda in creating isolated social and local groups, any horizontal liaison inside the party would be disastrous. Those at the base of the party would not understand why one propaganda is made in one place, another elsewhere. On the contrary, the partitioning by propaganda must correspond to a partitioning within the party, and the only liaison system must be vertical. More important still is a system of executive cadres. This produces from the beginning a schism between the cadres and the voters or sympathizers. What's a cadre? Why do you always want a link? I don't host open panels. Just like reading a book. A small group of people specially trained for a particular purpose, profession. Communication and cooperation is physical. Okay. Propaganda makes its agent a subject who makes the decisions and uses those systems that must obtain certain results. But the agent looks upon the mass of potential voters or sympathizers as objects. He manipulates them, works on them, tests them, changes them psychologically or politically. They no longer have any personal importance, especially when one realizes that good propaganda must be objective and anonymous. and the masses are considered as merely an instrument for attaining some objective. They are treated as such. This is one of the elements of the profound contempt that those making real propaganda have for all those on the outside, even and often particularly for their sympathizers. They're pay pigs. Isn't that funny? The people that control you have contempt for what a fucking easily controlled person you are. Propaganda accentuates the separation between manipulators and sympathizers, even as it tends to personalize power within the party. The inclination of the masses to admire personal power cannot be shunned by good propaganda. It can only be followed and exploited. To disregard it is to throw away an easy and active propaganda element. Propaganda, therefore, intensifies this inclination by creating the image of a leader and investing it with attributes of omnipresence and omniscience, and by supporting with active evidence what public consciousness only sensed and anticipated. Any party that avoids this personalization of power loses a probably decisive card. We have seen this in the American election of 1952 with Eisenhower. In most cases, this personalized power is closely tied to the organization of propaganda itself. In connection with certain parties, Duverger speaks of a second power, an obscured power that sometimes dominates the direction of the party. This second power sometimes consists of influential men on a paper whose distribution assures the party's strength. This fact needs to be generalized. In modern parties, this second power is likely to consist of corps of propagandists. The same holds true for the state itself. The propaganda instrument tend to assume a preponderant position, not without occasional serious conflicts, for there are at one and the same time the hub of the entire party and its raison d'etre, whatever that is. For they are at one at the same time the hub of the entire party and its raison d'etre. I don't know what that is. French. These are the principal effects of the adoption of modern propaganda on the structure of a political party. With regard to the relative effects on the interplay of parties in the national fabric, the decisive element is the high cost of propaganda. Propaganda is becoming more and more expensive, partly because of the volume needed, partly because of the instruments required. All parties may stick to traditional and low-level propaganda, posters, newspapers, and go to the government for the more expensive media, radio, TV. Such is the case in France. Under such circumstances, there is a state of equilibrium, but a precarious one. The situation is, in effect, unstable. If one party resorts to propaganda, the whole edifice tumbles. Our first such hypothesis: a single party takes big propaganda action, while the others cannot regroup or put into operation the necessary big apparatus because they lack money, people, organization. From then on, we see such a party rise like a rocket, as Hitler's party did in Germany in 1932, or the communist parties in France and Italy in 1945. This is clearly a menace to democracy. We are face to face with an overwhelmingly strong party that will capture the government. This party continues to grow stronger as it becomes richer and assumes more solid propaganda foundations. It definitely jeopardizes the democratic system, even if it has no dictatorial ambitions. For the other parties, incapable of regaining the mass of those 75% undecided, are increasingly unable to use big propaganda. Such a development may, of course, be changed by external influences. This happened when the progress of communist parties in France and Italy came to an end after 1948 with the regression of their propaganda, which was by no means attributable to their past mistakes. A second hypothesis: the opposition parties find a reply to big propaganda, but this can only be through a regrouping of forces, which is hard to attain because internal squabbles are stronger than the need for a common counter-propaganda, as in France between 1949 and 1958, or by an appeal to the government, which may then put communication means and money at the disposal of the party to oppose some totalitarian propaganda. This was the case in Belgium in connection with Rexist counter-propaganda. The third hypothesis: a party or a block of parties, almost as powerful as the would-be runaway party, starts big propaganda before it is pushed to the wall. This is the case in the United States, and might be in France, if the regrouping of the right should become stabilized. In that situation, one would necessarily have, for financial reasons, a democracy reduced to two parties. It is being inconceivable that a large number of parties would have sufficient means to make such propaganda. This would lead to a bipartite structure, not for reasons of doctrine or tradition, but for technical propaganda reasons. This implies the exclusion of new parties in the future. Not only are secondary parties progressively eliminated, but it becomes impossible to organize new political groups with any chance at all of making them heard. In the midst of the concerted power of the forces at work, it becomes increasingly difficult to establish a new program. On the other hand, such a group would need, from the beginning, a great deal of money, many members, and great power. Under such conditions, a new party could be born as Athena emerging fully grown from Zeus's forehead. A political organism would have had to collect money for a long time in advance, to have bought propaganda instruments and united its members before it made its appearance as a party capable of resisting the pressures of those who possess the media. Holy shit. That's crazy. Not just the mere organization of a new party is becoming increasingly difficult, so is expression of a new political idea or doctrine. Ideas no longer exist except through the media of information. When the latter are in the hands of existing parties, no truly revolutionary or new doctrine has any chance of expressing itself, of existing. Yet, innovation was one of the principal characteristics of democracy. Now, because nobody wants it any longer, it tends to disappear. One can say that propaganda almost inevitably leads to a two-party system. Not only would it be very difficult for several parties to be rich enough to support such expensive campaigns of propaganda, but also propaganda tends to schematicize public opinion. Where there is propaganda, we find fewer and fewer nuances and refinements of detail or doctrine. Rather, opinions are more incisive. There is only black and white, yes and no. Such a state of public opinion leads directly to a two-party system and the disappearance of a multi-party system. The effects of propaganda can also be clearly seen in view of what Duverger calls the party with the majority mandate and the party without that mandate. The party with the majority mandate, which ordinarily should command an absolute majority in Parliament, is normally the one that has been created by propaganda. Propaganda's principle trumps then slip out the hands of the other parties. All the latter can do is make demagogic demagogic propaganda, i.e., a false propaganda, that is purely artificial, considering what we have said about the relationship between propaganda and reality. In other words, the party out of power must pick an artificial issue. In that case, we find ourselves faced with two completely contradictory propagandas. On the one side is a propaganda powerful in media and techniques, but limited in ends and modes of expression. A propaganda strictly integrated into a given social group, conformist and statist. On the other is a propaganda weak in regard to media and techniques, but excessive in its ends and expressions. A propaganda aimed against the existing order, against the state, against prevailing group standards. But one must never forget that the party with the majority mandate, which adjusts its propaganda to that mandate and even uses the mandate as a propaganda aim, is nevertheless also the creation of propaganda, which hands it that mandate in a given setting for a long period of time. So I think when I was a kid, the party with the majority mandate was the Republican Party, and then the Democratic Party was like the Revolutionary Party. And now, as I'm an adult, it's flipped, whereas now the Democratic Party is the mandate and the Republican Party is the Revolutionary Party. Finally, a last word on the financial problems and their implications. It is improbable that contributions alone would enable a party to pay for the increasingly expensive propaganda media. The parties are therefore forced to look for aid either to capitalists and thus indenture themselves to a financial oligarchy, or to a government, national or foreign. In the second case, the state comes close to appropriating the instruments. The state then lends them to those who ask for them, which is very democratic, and thus permits secondary parties to live. But this leads to an unstable situation, as I said earlier, and the state is then increasingly forced to exercise censorship over what is being said by means of these instruments. This censorship will be increasingly rigorous, as the state itself is forced to make more propaganda. This leads us to examine the hypothesis of a state that ceases to be neutral in the ideological domain and assumes a doctrine or an ideology of its own. At that moment, propaganda by the state is imposed on all parties. To be sure, we are dealing with propaganda. We have seen in past decades with regard to all state religions that power must first be used to shape public opinion, without which they could not operate. Thus, at the beginnings of the Nazi state or of popular democracies, a certain competition continued between propaganda of the state and that of the parties out of power. But in such competition, the state necessarily emerges victorious. It increasingly denies the use of mass media of communication to the opposition parties. It works on public opinion until the moment arrives when it can simply suppress opposition parties without fear. But the state can work on public opinion only through the intermediary of a party. This is another effect of propaganda. One could conceive of a state that would suppress all parties and live by itself. That was the classic pattern of dictatorship. However, that is no longer possible. Once public opinion has been aroused and alerted to political problems, it must be taken into consideration. The propaganda mechanism of the state cannot function as an administrative unit. It cannot have reality or efficiency except through the media of the state party. It is impossible to imagine that a modern state could command acceptance without working through a party establishing contact between those who govern and public opinion. The party's fundamental role is to make propaganda for government, i.e., the propaganda that the government wishes to be made. In one sense, incidentally, we find here the image of a party in its purest state, for ultimately, every party is a propaganda machine, but this is much more hidden in other systems in which there still can be nuances and discussions. In dictatorships, the party no longer serves any ideological or political function, no longer expresses social interests, and so on. It is an organ designed to tame and train public opinion, and exists solely because of the state's need. As soon as that need diminishes, the role and prestige of the party also diminish. This happened in Nazi Germany in 1938 and in the Soviet Union after the purges of 1936. But as soon as propaganda again becomes important, the party resumes its role. Propaganda very clearly gives direction to life of political parties, imposes certain forms and rules on them, sends them down certain paths, and ends up deciding their life or death until the regime expands to the point at which propaganda and the party are totally fused. My voice is kind of... In illuminating the role of propaganda from this angle, I was not trying to say that propaganda is the only factor in the evolution of parties. It certainly combines with other elements, of which one can say, however, that they are either of less importance than propaganda or are tied with it. And I'm going to quit early because my voice is sore. Bam.